scripture reading, again, is found in your bulletin. It's a rather lengthy one today. Where we last left off was the Last Supper. So the very next verse that follows the Last Supper is when they had sung a hymn. They went out to the Mount of Olives. You will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, it means he threw a conniption fit. Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. What else could they say? They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. And going a little further, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Then he returned to his disciples and he found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Once more he went away and he prayed the same thing. And when he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. And they did not know what to say to him. And returning the 3rd time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough, the hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. And just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. And with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. And going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. And then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scripture must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled. And a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. And when they seized him, he fled away naked, leaving his garment behind. We started off singing the song In the Garden. In seminary, we jokingly called it the Andy song. Andy talks with me, Andy walks with me, Andy tells me that I am his own. But the garden story that we're going to look at today is not a garden of dew on the roses. It is a garden of an incredible struggle, of oppressing that takes place. So if it works, we have a video that I want to show you. We're going to show the movie, The Passion of the Christ, on Good Friday. Encourage you to come and watch that movie with us, but I want to show you the opening scene of this movie, which takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane.
아버지 어디였더니 그만 비에스라니 샤브레니 메레샤다세 토몬루알라
Kostia min am, dia nash kahil mahir mo ba? Ni ko.
Благослови навши Адонай. Благослови. Кто ты?
Laithai. Anashtige. Lagaitha. Yakir sagi. Yaka. Bidion. Masha. Laithai. Anashtige. La. Laithai.
아빠, 꼴렛게고 해나가 거스게 되니 Lakisman. Little way the Lakisman.
My back.
What?
My arm.
Nej, eller... Stay up and high. Men maybe. Schlagartig. Oavbitaka. Emma. Honey. تلخك من مني
You want to see the rest of it? Good Friday. I need my slide to move now. There we go. When you go to Israel today and you go to Jerusalem, you'll see a very famous church which is called the Church of All Nations. And where this church is located is in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is thought to be the spot where Jesus prayed, not my will be done, but your will be done. You can see it's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful building. It has that incredible mosaic fresco that's on the front of it. It's got 4 statues of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in front of it. When you go in the building, the glass in the windows is all turquoise colored. So no matter what time of day you go into the building, even if it's the bright sunny day, it always feels like twilight. It always feels like the evening from when Jesus was praying. There is a stone that's on the floor, and the stone now is basically its ground level. It used to be about waist high. But this was thought to be the rock where Jesus knelt and prayed and leaned against when he was praying that his will not be done, but that God's will would be done. As you can tell, over the centuries, numerous pilgrims have chiseled off pieces of the rock to keep as relics to take home with them. So now it is down to just this part, which they won't let you take a part of the rock anymore. You can't have any pebbles of it anymore. And it is located right in the middle of the Garden of Gethsemane. There are olive trees. Gethsemane means olive press. And so there are olive trees all around this church still. Those two trees that you see, the one in the middle and the one on the right, those trees are over 2,000 years old, which means that when those trees would have been there when Jesus was praying at the Garden of Gethsemane. It's a very beautiful place. It's a highlight for people to come to the Garden of Gethsemane and to go to the Church of All Nations. It's a very pretty place. People come to the church and there's a hushed silence, and they go into the church and it's very quiet, it's very peaceful. But the Garden of Gethsemane was anything but peaceful on that night that Jesus was there. There was a pressing, a crushing that was taking place. Jesus has just finished the Last Supper with his disciples, and he has told them that somebody's going to betray him, and Judas has already left. And then they probably left in 2 or 3 different groups so as to not to be followed and discovered. And so they leave from the upper room, which is clear up in the southwest corner of the city of Jerusalem, and they're going to make their way all the way down through the Kidron Valley, and then they start to go back up the Mount of Olives to where this Garden of Gethsemane is. It was known to the disciples, probably because Jesus had taught there before with them, and they probably had camped in this particular area. And so then they all got together again in this Garden of Gethsemane, and there, Jesus tells them, and he says that you are going to be offended by me. Now, unfortunately, in the NIV, which we read, and in the New Revised Standard Version, the NIV says that you will fall away. And the New Revised Standard Version says that you will be scattered. And they're unfortunate translations, because what they're taking is the Zechariah verse where Jesus says the shepherd will be killed and the sheep will be scattered. And so they are taking a word in the Greek. It's actually, I won't pronounce this quite right, but it's scandaleste, scandalized. You will be scandalized, and then you will all fall away, or you will all be scattered. And so what Jesus is saying to them is, you're going to be offended by what's going to happen. You're going to be offended by what's happening to me in the garden. You're going to be offended by me as to what's going to happen shortly when I'm going to be hung up on the cross. And so you're all going to scatter. You're all going to fall away. You're all going to leave. You're going to be scandalized. And so Peter rebels against this. And he says, everybody else might leave you, everybody else might take off, everybody else might deny you, but I never will. Now, there is an irony here that I want us to catch. When Jesus was walking up to Caesarea Philippi, do you remember the story? And he's taking the disciples with him, and he asks them, and he says, who do people say that I am? And they said, well, you're John the Baptist reincarnated and all this stuff. And he says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter makes the declaration. You remember it? You are the Christ. You're the Messiah. And then Jesus says, that's right. And here's what's going to happen to the Messiah is I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to die. And you remember what Peter did? He rejects that. And he says, no, you're the Messiah. You can't die. You're supposed to be the king. You're supposed to lead us into victory. And Jesus says to him, Satan, get behind me. Peter had a meltdown with Jesus about what it meant to be the Messiah. Do you see the irony now here? Because Peter was upset because, and we've had this phrase over and over and over again, and so I hope you got this. It's not enough just to know what the rabbi knows. You need to what the rabbi does. And so in order to follow the Messiah, to be a disciple, it means you have to be willing to suffer and die. Peter says, there's no way. that I'm going to do that. Now what happens? They're in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus says, you guys are all going to be scandalized. Peter argues with Jesus with as much anger and passion as he did on the way to the Caesarea Philippi when he says that, I'll never deny you. I'll die with you. I'll do whatever I need to do. And Jesus says to him, no, you won't. You're going to deny me 3 times before morning, before the rooster crows. Peter has had a terrible night. Mark doesn't tell us the details that he's having an awful night. John's gospel does, and we're going to look at that on Monday, Thursday. But Peter has had to give up his seat of honor. He's been humiliated and embarrassed with the washing of the feet episode. He's trying to get himself in good graces with Jesus again. He's trying to show that he's going to be a loyal disciple. And Jesus just slams him again and says, no, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows twice. And he says, no, I won't. You can just hear him protesting, saying, I'll die with you. His intentions are good, but his words are going to fall so far short. He completely missed the fact that Jesus says, I'm going to rise from the dead, and then I'm going to go ahead of you to Galilee. And instead, he throws all the other disciples under the bus. Even if they deny you, I never will. And so now what can the disciples say? No, we're not going to deny you either. And so Peter is already being offended. He's being offended by what's happened to him. He's being offended by Jesus' message. And he's offending the other disciples by saying that they won't be as loyal as he is. This is an olive press. Olive oil is made by taking ripe olives, putting them into this stone basin. Then they use a millstone, and they roll it around, oftentimes using a donkey or something. They'd stick a long log in that millstone and would roll it around, and it crushes the olives. And then the oil or the juice from the olives rolls down into a little hole that's near the bottom of the side of this press. And there it's filtered and it's collected in jars. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's in the garden of the pressing and crushing of olives. And Jesus is going to be crushed and pressed in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so he says to his disciples, pray. Now, don't get confused on this. Jesus isn't asking the disciples to pray for him. Neither is he asking the disciples to pray with him. He's telling them to pray because they are going to enter into a time of trial and testing. And then he takes 3 disciples with him, Peter, James, and John. And they go further into the garden. And he says to them, stay awake, keep alert, pay attention, because a time of trial is coming. And then Jesus goes even a little further into the garden, and he is in great distress. The movie that we looked at showed you the distress. Luke's gospel tells us that when Jesus was praying, that he sweat drops of blood. So great was his anguish. And there Jesus begins to pray and is being crushed and poured out as he prays to God that not my will be done, but your will would be done. Now, an interesting thing is that in Mark's gospel, we're only told that Jesus prays 3 times. Kind of amazing, isn't it? That Mark only tells us 3 times that Jesus prayed, and only once are we given the content of his prayer. In his first prayer that we read about, that's in Mark 1, verse 35, Jesus has begun his public ministry. He has just healed Peter's mother-in-law. The disciples are looking for Jesus, and they find him outside, and we are told that he was praying. And then he says to his disciples, we need to go and to share the good news to all the villages in Israel. The second time that we read that Jesus prayed, he's just fed the 5,000, and Jesus goes up on the mountain to pray, and he puts the disciples in the boat, and he sends them on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and then he catches up later with them by walking on water. This is the only time that we are told the content of what Jesus prayed. As he goes into the garden and he's under this incredible distress, he's being crushed. He's being ground down by the millstone of what he has about to do. And so we are told that what he prays for is that not his will would be done, but that he would do the Father's will. He prays that this cup, that it might be passed from him and that he would not have to drink of it. So notice what he prays. He addresses God with a term of endearment. Now, when the disciples said, "Teach us to pray," he says, "When you pray, say, Abba, our Father." Now, that was unheard of in Jewish thinking. You didn't even say the name of God. You certainly would not refer to God as being your Father and use a term of endearment like Papa. And yet, here's what we find Jesus is saying. He calls out and he says, "Abba, my Father." And he says, "For you, all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but you want." What was this cup that Jesus wanted taken away? It wasn't the crucifixion. Now, obviously, he did not want to experience the pain of crucifixion. Jesus had seen crucifixions. You could not have lived in Israel for 33 years during the time of Jesus and not have been exposed to numerous Roman crucifixions. Everybody in Israel was aware of the horror and the pain and the suffering that takes place when somebody was crucified. But it wasn't the physical pain that Jesus was concerned about. It was the spiritual pain that he was concerned about. In fact, it's phenomenal that whenever, in all four of the Gospels, the only thing you're told about the crucifixion is it says Jesus was crucified between two thieves. Nobody tells you about the agony of what happens when somebody is on the cross. There's absolutely no mention made whatsoever of the physical pain that Jesus endured because everybody knew that. What the gospel stories repeatedly tell us over and over again was the spiritual pain that Jesus was experiencing. Because what he was experiencing was separation from God. Now, we don't understand that. But Jesus is God. He is God who is made flesh. He is just as much God as God the Father is. He was there with the creation of the world. He took part in the creation of the world. He has always existed and he always will exist. He was always with God. And yet what Paul tells us in his letter to the Philippians is that Jesus emptied himself. That somehow in his becoming a human being and taking on human form, there was a part of his divinity that somehow that he emptied himself of, which now makes him vulnerable to human suffering, but also allows him to totally identify with the human condition. But he knows now that he who knew no sin is now going to become sin. That he who had never been separated from God is now going to be separated from God. The word death, thanatos, does not just mean the ceasing of our life function. It means to be separated. So to die means to be separated from the land of the living, but the main emphasis means to be separated from God. The word sin, armatia, means to miss the mark. And the wages of sin, or the penalty of sin, is to be separated from God. That's what Jesus wanted to be passed from him. He did not want to be separated from God. He did not want to have to become sin. He did not want to experience the wrath of God. And so that's why he fell on the ground and why he sweat drops of blood and why he was in such anguish, because he knew that he was going to be separated from God. Did you catch in the movie where the Satan said to him, "You can't do it. Nobody can die for the sins of the world." This is too hard. That was exactly what Jesus was feeling at that particular point. This is too hard. So Jesus comes back from praying. He does this 3 times where he prays. He comes back and he finds the disciples sleeping. Now, again, there's a parallel here that I don't want us to miss. Who did Jesus take up on the Mount of Transfiguration with him? Peter, James, and John. Who does he take deep into the Garden of Gethsemane with him? Peter, James, and John. It's the same ones. They saw Jesus transfigured, saw his glory. Now they see Jesus transfigured in a different way. They see him being crushed for them. And they're asleep. And the word sleep is the same word that was used when they were up on the Mount of Transfiguration. They were in a stupor. They were aware of what Jesus was doing, but they couldn't keep their eyes open. They couldn't stay awake. And so Jesus says to them, could you not stay awake for 1 hour? You need to keep watch. Jesus had just told a parable about keeping watch, where the chief of the servants, the doorkeeper, is to keep watch because he doesn't know when the master is going to return home. And he is to make sure that all the rest of the servants are doing their duty. And so he is to keep watch. He is to stay awake. He's to be alert. And so here's Peter, the one who said, I'll never deny you, that I'll follow you into death. And he's asleep at the switch. He has not been able to stay awake. It was James and John. They were the ones who said to Jesus, let one of us sit at your left hand and let one of us sit at your right hand. And Jesus said to them, can you drink the cup that I'm about to drink? And then that's where we get our famous hymn, Are you able, said the Master, to be crucified with me? And yea, the sturdy dreamers to the death will follow thee. They're asleep. They're not able to do what they had boasted, what they had claimed. And so Jesus rebukes them, but his rebuke is gentle. And we need to realize here that don't ever, we fall into the trap in thinking that Jesus somehow needed the disciples to pray for him, that he was lacking human compassion and company, and he wanted them to be there with him, to support him and to help him. That's not it at all. Jesus has never needed human help. He didn't need the disciples to pray with him or to pray for him. He went to his Father for that. What he was telling them is that they needed to pray for themselves, to pay attention, to watch, because they were going to undergo trial. And so now, even in this great anguish and pain that he is under, he is concerned about his disciples. He is still ministering to them. And so his rebuke is tinged with compassion when he says to them, oh, the spirit is willing, your intent is willing, but you've had too much food, you've had too much wine, and you've had too much drama. And you just can't do it. So 3 times Jesus goes and he prays. 3 times he comes back and he finds the disciples are unable to keep watch, unable to keep the promise that they had said that they would keep. The 3rd time he comes back and he says to them, are you still sleeping, you sleepyheads? Are you still taking a nap? He says, look, my betrayer is at hand. The hour has come. The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going, for see, the betrayer is at hand. Jesus is not afraid of the crucifixion. Not afraid of the arrest. He stands up and he boldly faces the betrayer who is coming. And so we find out that it was Judas. Of course, we already knew that it was Judas. And so Judas comes and he identifies Jesus with a kiss. You ever wondered why he identified him with a kiss? Because in that particular culture, they didn't shake hands. You greet people with a kiss. And so it was dark. And there were probably numerous groups of people camping on the Mount of Olives. Judas, being a disciple, he knew where Jesus' camped was. So he comes to Jesus' camp, kisses him on the cheek as a means of greeting. That was the sign to the temple guard to arrest Jesus. And suddenly it happened. Jesus was arrested. Things became violent. Peter, to his credit, rouses from his sleep. John's gospel tells us that he has a sword and that he chops off the ear of a servant by the name of Malchus. Peter is doing what he said he would do. I'll fight for you. I won't deny you. I'll do whatever it is that I need to do. And then Jesus cries out and he says to the soldiers, to the temple guard, he says, I'm not a robber. You come out here with clubs and swords to arrest me as though I'm just a common thief. Day by day I had been in the temple and you didn't do anything to arrest me. But in order that the scriptures might be fulfilled and because it is your hour, let it be. One of the disciples, most scholars think that it was John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, was asleep. And he was just he had taken off his outer clothing, was just wearing his linen garment, a sleeping gown, just sort of like a shift or something like that, and was quite comfortable. And he got woke up by the temple guards, tries to run away. One of the temple guards grabbed him, and he ducked and pulled out of his clothes and runs away naked. Peter, to his credit, follows Jesus all the way in to the Garden of to Caiaphas' house and begins to watch the trial. The rooster hasn't crowed yet. Peter hasn't denied him 3 times yet, but he has fallen asleep 3 times. And the rooster is getting agitated, and Peter is getting offended. When I was competing as an athlete, I can tell you that the hardest part about competing was getting ready to compete. The race wasn't tough. It was getting psyched up for the race that was tough. I was more nervous getting ready for the race than I was once the gun went off. That was easy. Everything just takes over and you just run. I saw an awful lot of my teammates who would throw up not after the race, they'd throw up before the race because they were so nervous and anxious. You've heard the phrase getting psyched up. Kevin Garnett is getting psyched up to play a game. The mental stress of getting ready is even harder than getting physically ready. Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane getting psyched up, getting ready. There are many commentaries and scholars, and I agree with them, that probably the real work of salvation did not take place on the cross, but in the garden. Because it was in the garden that Jesus surrendered his will to God. The cross was just running the race. In the garden is when Jesus could have said no. But he didn't. He said, not my will be done, but yours. Here's another irony for us. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve disobeyed. And they were cursed. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus obeyed. And the curse is lifted. Did you see in the movie the serpent that came out of Satan's foot? There was a serpent in both of those gardens. Genesis tells us that there is one coming who will crush the head of the serpent. It was in the Garden of Gethsemane and on the cross that Jesus crushed the head of the serpent and broke the curse. So what's your Garden of Gethsemane? Because the Garden of Gethsemane is not where God meets us with the dew on the roses. It's not where Andy walks with me, Andy talks with me, and Andy tells me that I am his own. The Garden of Gethsemane is where we need to deny ourselves and to follow Jesus. Now, I won't speak for you, but I'll speak for me. Sometimes my Garden of Gethsemane is my checkbook. Because my will is I want to spend my money on me. Whose money is it really? You know that answer. It's actually everything I have is a gift from God. And so oftentimes the Garden of Gethsemane for me is, where do I spend my money? Do I spend it for my pleasures? Or do I give it back to God to be used for his kingdom? Sometimes the Garden of Gethsemane for me, and this is probably the biggest one and the most often one, is the Garden of Gethsemane for me is priorities. I like to set my priorities so that they serve me. I want to be, king. I want people to do what I want them to do. And what I want them to do is to serve me. I'm not the only one, right? We want people to do for us. And so what suffering means is when I don't get my way. Lame, right? So the Garden of Gethsemane for me is not what my will is, but what are God's priorities? See, I don't want to serve. And when I do serve, I want to serve people who are going to serve me back. You remember that sermon from a couple of weeks ago? And I don't mind giving, but I want to give money, or I want to give time, or I want to give things to people who are going to give back. I want to give to people who deserve it, so that I'm the one who's judging as to what's going on. Jesus gave, didn't ask questions. He served. He emptied himself. My Garden of Gethsemane is I need to surrender my priorities to God's priorities. My Garden of Gethsemane is every day. It's not just physically suffering. It's making the decision to follow Jesus. It's not enough just to know what my rabbi knows. Anybody can know what the rabbi knows. It's to do what my rabbi does. Does my life give evidence that I actually know Jesus? I don't know what your Garden of Gethsemane is, but you do. Let's pray.